Welcome to all of you for this discussion of Ukraine 4 years on from the full-scale Russian invasion and 12 years on from the Russian seizure of Crimea and support for rebellion in Donbass. It's a good time as any to take stock, and for that purpose, we have three amazingly qualified, SAIS-connected experts. Professor Eugene Finkel, who joins from SAIS Europe, was born in Ukraine and grew up in Israel. His book, Intent to Destroy, documents 2 centuries of Russian efforts to dominate Ukraine. I underline the word document as he brings deep historical knowledge and analysis to the task. I trust he'll offer some insights from that impressive work. SAIS Russian Studies PhD, Lauren Van Metre, is now president and CEO of Women in International Security. She joins us from Belfast, where she finds herself stuck due to family challenges. She will offer insights from her many trips into Ukraine, bringing assistance to civil society organizations working near the front lines on the Ukrainian side of the front lines. I hope she'll give us an idea of what life is like in the frontline cities and how are these cities changing the political landscape of Ukraine. Professor Sergey Radchenko, who also joins from SAIS Europe, is an expert on the Cold War as well as Sino-Soviet relations. But he has also written perceptively on negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, most recently in Foreign Affairs in December. I hope he will comment on the similarities and differences between Russian behavior today and Soviet behavior during the Cold War, as well as suggest things the US and Europe should and should not do in the negotiation process. We're all grateful to Carla Freeman and the SAIS Foreign Policy Initiative that she directs for providing this forum, and to Brent for organizing. The panel will start with presentations of less than 15 minutes. Afterwards, I'll try to generate some controversy among them before turning to audience Q&A. Professor Finkel, please start us off.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, and thank you all for coming. I don't see you back there in DC, but hello from Bologna. Anyhow, so I was asked, to talk about where it all comes from and more the origins of the war rather than where we currently stand. And for me, it's also an exercise in, deep frustration in reading the news and the discussions. I don't want to touch too much upon what my colleague, Professor Radchenko, might be speaking on, but every time I hear this news story or that news story, or that peace plan or this peace plan, Donbass, maybe Donbass plus, maybe Donbass minus, maybe peace will come if Ukraine gives up on joining NATO, I just want to scream, like monk style, endless scream, like get a grip, people, what the hell are you talking about? And I usually start, when I talk about where this war comes from. Can I share a screen for a moment?
Sure, I think
okay,
so.
Okay, let's try. Okay, so I want to start with 3 quotes, and usually I do a quiz asking people, how, here they are. How many of them belong to the Russian President, Vladimir Putin? And usually I have, a sea of hands saying 3, some saying 2, but it's actually only the first one, even though they're identical. They're pretty much identical, use the same languages and the same arguments. So only the first one is Putin from his seminal 2021 article about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he was screaming at us, that's what I believe, that's what I'm going to do. And we all said, no, he doesn't think it. Well, he did. What are the other 2, though? They also agree. They also come from Russian leaders from different regimes and different periods. So the second one is the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army during World War I. just before Russia invaded the Ukraine, what is now Western Ukraine, and back then were the Austrian provinces of Galicia and Bukovina with the same logic. And the third one is Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, justifying the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, when Stalin and Hitler decided to divide Europe. So different regimes, different periods, different leaders, but the logic is absolutely the same, and even the language is the same. And if you haven't read Putin carefully, you wouldn't even know where does it, who said what. So I will stop sharing because I don't need this anymore. But where does this logic come from? And that's also what I'm trying to understand in my work, because even though I'm a political scientist by training, when I came to trying to explain this war, I realized that I cannot start in 2022 and not even in 2014 to make sense of what's happening. I had to go back to early mid-19th century. And essentially what I figured out while working on that book, or just the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations, is that essentially over the last 200 years, there was a constant theme and a constant goal and pretty much constant mode of operation coming out of Moscow and St. Petersburg with regards to Ukraine. And the main motive was that, controlling and dominating Ukraine was the key policy goal. And I would even say an obsession for the Russian and Soviet and post-Soviet Russian leaders. Now, where does this obsession come from? And that's, another part of the debates in DC or in the media that I'm also, very frustrated with, whether it's all about identity or security, whether it's about Russian Empire, or whether it's all about NATO and, US bases or whatever threat they might pose to the Russian national security. And the truth is that, it's both. You can say that it's either or. It's a combination of identity and security, though historically the identity component is so much more important than the security one. Now, where does this identity component come from? And it's important to understand what drives Russia and what drives Russian policies and Russian thinking about Ukraine. And this identity obsession with Ukraine is essentially a three-pronged story. The third part of it is that both Russia and Ukraine trace their history to the same place, Kievan Rus, a medieval state that was pretty large, pretty successful, but then destroyed by the Mongol invasion in the 30th century. And while after the Mongol invasion, the parts that were now Ukraine and Belarus were absorbed by Poland and Lithuania, Moscow emerged out of the period of Mongol rule as a very dynamic, very successful, very confident state that also had this deep built-in belief that they're a successor of Kiev as the center of this, or inheritor of this earlier state, and therefore it has the natural right to dominate all the territories that belong to Kiev and Rus, including, of course, Kiev. Now, this origin story is not unique. Quite a few states, place or trace their history to some old polities or mythical cities. The problem is that Kiev is not just some mythical ancient place like Troy. It's also a capital of a completely different country that the Russians genuinely believe that they have a natural right to, if not own, then at least control or dominate. So that's the first part of this obsession. The second part is the very ingrained belief, and that's a cornerstone of Russian historiography, of Russian thinking, of large part of Russian literature, and right now, for many years, also the Russian curriculum. That's what Russian school children, and before them, Soviet school children were taught, is that the Russian people consist of three branches. The Great Russians, which are the Russians themselves, the Little Russians, those are the Ukrainians, and the White Russian, Belarusians, but they're essentially the same people. Now, if you also terms Great Russians and Little Russians also imply hierarchical relationships with Russians being naturally on top and Ukrainians being just below them. It wasn't always meant to be this way. Originally, it started simply as geographical term, but once you start using the language of great and little Russians, then this hierarchical relationship has to evolve. So a lot of the Russian reactions to what Ukraine tries to do simply boils down to who the hell you think you are and how dare you to want to do something without asking us first. And a third prong of this identity view is that all those three branches, the Great Russians, the Little Russians, and the White Russians, have only one proper language for science, literature, administration, and that's of course, Russians. Ukrainian and Belarusians are peasant dialects who do not deserve their own literature, their own culture, their own space. In fact, using Ukrainian or Belarusians, for those tasks would be simply a waste of time and resources. Russian is perfectly fine for that. So, and that's also, goes to the Russian obsession with language and, which language is being spoken in Ukraine and how Ukrainian and Russian are treated. And this view became so commonplace over the years that it's essentially turned into a hegemonic view of what Russian identity is. And the cornerstone of this hegemonic identity is a belief that Ukraine belongs to us, Russians, even if not necessarily in terms of direct ownership, but in terms of being able to have a de facto say on what it does and having veto powers or whatever is done in Kiev. That's the identity part. Where the security part come from? It's much less important, but it's also there. First, it's the national security part, the part that people who really believe that it's all about NATO tend to focus on. And historically, most of Western invasions of Russia and Soviet Union came through Ukraine. And it makes sense. There are natural borders between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, the Carpathian Mountains, the Pripyat Marshes. But once you pass those, there is an open steppe, and the road to Moscow and St. Petersburg is pretty much open. So Russians do worry about this national security component. But if you actually ask Russians, and if you read, Russian politicians and Russian thinkers and Russian strategists, whenever they start talking and writing about Ukraine, it's only a minor part. It's there, but it's secondary. What they care much more about in terms of security is the regime security, not the national security. And nothing scares, the Russian elite and the Kremlin, especially if it's an autocratic elite, then an independent democratic Ukraine, because if those people are the same people and Ukrainians manage to build a democratic state and elect and kick out their leaders if they don't like them, which Ukrainians do all the time, then God forbid Russians, who are presumably the same people, might want to do the same, and that should not be allowed. Now it's a catch-22, situation that Russian elites corner themselves into. They can easily get out of this by simply saying that, Russians and Ukrainians are different peoples with different histories and different modes of organizing, but that would undermine the basis of what Russian identity is. So they're stuck with this belief, and the only way to deal with this threat is to make sure that Ukraine remains autocratic or becomes autocratic and being fully controlled by Moscow. So that's essentially what drives Russian behavior over the years. And another feature of that, very briefly in 2 minutes, is that over the last 200 years, the Russian Imperial, the Soviet, and the post-Soviet Russian elites tried to impose with their relations in Ukraine what they call the divide and repress strategy. Ukraine is an extremely heterogeneous country, so at every given moment in time, either Moscow or St. Petersburg would choose some people in Ukraine who they saw as a threat, and they would be mercilessly repressed. But at the same time, there would be other groups that will be elevated, protected, and serve as local agents and provide Moscow with the manpower, with the local knowledge, with the resources, with the local legitimacy. And that's exactly what the Russians did over the last 200 years, and that's exactly what Putin tried to do in his relations with Ukraine. The problem for him that after 2014, after the Euromaidan, after the annexation of Crimea, this model no longer worked. There were no large and influential groups in Ukraine willing to serve in Moscow's agents. So this divide and repress strategy for the first time failed because Ukraine finally emerged as a civic, more or less unified political nation. And that's to a large degree what explains the Russian invasion, this switch from trying to work to agents to using direct military force to try to enforce their will. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Finkel. This focus on the identity aspect of the Russian behavior towards Ukraine seems to me to be very much on Lauren Van Metre's mind as well. So let me turn to Lauren, who has a kind of on-the-ground experience near the front lines that I envy, I confess. Lauren?
Thank you, Dan. Just by background, I want to say that I began working in Ukraine with the U.S. Institute of Peace as far back as 2015, working with internally displaced persons, and then with the Atlantic Council from 2016, following the treatment of veterans who had very clearly become a target of political opportunism in Ukraine's political sphere. And then since the full-scale invasion, I have supported dozens of frontline communities through fundraising and purchasing of cars, emergency and survival equipment for a national network of local women leaders, helping communities in Chernihiv, Chernivtsi, Kherson, Dnipro, and other very small local rural communities in Ukraine. So I do want to say my experience is virtual. I am not there on the ground, but I am in daily and weekly contact, I think, with a lot of these leaders in these communities. For the discussion today, please bear with me, because I'm actually going to start back in 2014. I really want to sort of give you all a sort of an expose of civil society and the important role, both politically and identity-wise, that it gives Ukraine. And to begin that story, we do have to start back in 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, which was an event that was often grouped, I think, with the so-called color revolutions, but I would argue is really distinct from them, and that it was primarily, it was not a rights-based uprising centered on discrete claims, voting rights, youth rights, gender rights, or very narrow constituencies. It was a values-based movement grounded in dignity, accountability, and respect for every citizen. While these rights-based movements can often segment and divide whose rights are more important, yours or mine, values-based movements have the power to unify. And the Maidan demonstrated the extraordinary mobilizing force of shared civic values. And the other thing I really want to emphasize about the Maidan and this mass values mobilization is that what we witness in Ukraine today in civil society is not a new phenomenon born of crisis in 2022. It is the continuation of Maidan. And for more than a decade, that civic awakening has endured. And what we're seeing today is really the long arc of a values-based civic revolution that never truly ended, as Dan said, has endured for 12 years. Its target has always been the tentacles of the Russian oligarchic system in Ukraine. Hold on. The disruption and dismantlement of that system, and Ukraine has been fighting the same war since 2014. Only the manifestations of scale have changed. When I first began working in Ukraine in 2015, it was very clear to me that civil society had delivered something extraordinary. It had prevented the collapse of the Ukrainian state and saved it from a disastrous humanitarian uh, catastrophe. Um, and how did it do that? The first move is that when Russia's invasion of the Donbass occurred, you saw the Maidan hundreds, volunteers run directly from the barricades of Kyiv to the front lines in the Donbass, and they became the backbone of early volunteer battalions. At the same time, you saw civil society groups mobilize nationwide, sourcing body armor when the Ministry of Defense could not. The Ministry of Defense was highly corrupted at that point. And in the first year of the war, Ukraine's civil society and citizens absorbed 800,000 IDPs from the East. I think the scale of that is something that we can't even begin to understand. So in this chaos, but there was also, I think, a second force at work, which was Ukraine's oligarchs. And I saw that personally myself. In the chaos of 2014 and 2015, we saw powerful businessmen step into the security vacuum. We saw Ihor Kolomoisky, then governor of Dnipropetrovsk region, finance volunteer battalions such as Dnipro 1. We saw Renat Akhmetov leverage his industrial and regional networks in the East to fund humanitarian operations while protecting, of course, his own economic assets. Some of this engagement was stabilizing. Oligarchic resources did help hold the line where the state's authority was fragile. But I would also argue it was also an extension of a long-standing system in which wealth, political power, and coercive capacity were intertwined. And I saw that firsthand in my work with both IDPs and veterans. So at the time, around 2016 to 2018, veterans were emerging as one of the most respected constituencies in Ukrainian society. And they became a focal point of competition because of sort of their powerful moral and political force. And I went to several veterans' political rallies organizing by political parties from the East, from Donbass, openly seeking political capture of veteran groups and services to achieve economic rents and buy a political base within the veterans communities. We also saw at the local level in Ukraine sort of pseudo NGOs popping up that were backed by oligarchic forces that were looking to capture the funding that was going in at the local level to local governments, local NGOs, flowing to local communities to support the humanitarian response. So I would say, from 2014 onward, Ukraine really has been in this delicate balancing act among three actors: civil society, the state, and oligarchic power. And for more than a decade, Ukraine has lived with this three-pronged struggle. But I would say the war has reordered this balance. The triangle still exists. The question is now who defines the center of gravity in this triangle? And I would say the answer is pretty clear right now. It is civil society and citizens. And I'd like to give three examples of sort of this preeminence of civil society. First, the Ukrainian army is Ukrainian society. Roughly 80% of Ukraine's armed forces are civilians who put on the uniform in February 2022. These are teachers, engineers, lawyers, farmers. This is not a professional caste system separate from Ukrainian society. It is truly the people's army. Civil military relations are not abstract in Ukraine, they are highly personal. And civil society is not merely supporting defense, it is a system of total defense of Ukraine. From the first days of the full-scale invasion, organizations have procured weapons, protective gear. They have crowd-funded campaigns to finance reconnaissance systems. Psychologists have supported traumatized families. Lawyers document war crimes. So I would also say too, just to make my case about sort of the growing predominance of civil society here, is that oligarchs, on the other hand, have also transformed, and they've seen a decline in their wealth with Ukraine's overall economic decline. Once exercising monopolistic control over fundamental sectors of Ukraine's economy, such as energy, precious metals, they've been forced to diversify their economic investments where they're into sectors where they're no longer the monopoly actors. And they have turned into philanthropic organizations, competing with each other to support the war in citizen-centered ways that look an awful lot like a burgeoning corporate responsibility sector. But I would argue that this ascendancy of citizens and this dominance is not guaranteed. It is under pressure from several converging threats. One I will call moral injury, and I would like to discuss this as, to me, it's the most personal for me. And I see it in my discussions with the leaders I support in frontline communities. Moral injury is not simply trauma. It really is the lasting harm that occurs when a person or community experiences a betrayal of moral trust. Um, it is a corrosive thought that I betrayed myself, or worse, that I betrayed someone I loved. And Ukrainians are now experiencing moral injury at an existential scale, the sense of having fallen short of one's own moral code. And I'd like to maybe just give you two examples of this, good people who've been placed in highly impossible situations. Following the Donbass, I met an IDP family, then still living in Donetsk, who jumped in their bakery van to rescue their mom-in-law, who lived closer to Russia, leaving their daughter with friends. And by the time they reached their mom, the Russians were already forming checkpoints, and they were stopped repeatedly and aggressively. The only thing that saved them was the bakery van. They claimed they were out on deliveries. And with every stop, the wife said to herself, I chose my mother-in-law over my daughter. And 2 years later, she still could not forgive herself. I have another colleague who has strong ties with the international community and managed to get both of her children out of the country and to France after the full-scale invasion. Her son is 30 years old. He has great deal of tech expertise. Um, Other sons like this are on the front lines. Her son is not, even though she fights in Ukraine 24/7 for our frontline communities. There is a sense of moral injury and that she will grow up, she will experience the rest of her life with a grandson while others will not. Um, so there's a danger, I think, that an unjust peace is going to cause further moral injury, demeaning Ukrainian sacrifices to geopolitical interests. This is why moral injury really, to me, is not just a private clinical or mental health issue. It really is an issue of Ukraine's ability to mount a total national defense effort and to mobilize in any post-conflict environment. The last thing I'd like to mention is sort of this threat to civil society. I hope is a nice bridge to the next conversation on the peace process, which is that the peace process brings other threats, I think, as well. And there's a lot of talk about territory, security guarantees, but really not much on this kleptocratic risk. And what we're witnessing, I think, in the negotiation is the risk of an oligarchic peace. If negotiations are structured around expediency and transactional power rather than sovereignty and rule of law, they will not dismantle this kleptocracy, which I say is dormant in Ukraine or slowly transitioning. It will reconfigure it. And I think that any settlement that legitimizes territorial seizure or empowers corruption networks there's a lot of talk around a free, economic zone in the Donbass, would strengthen these kleptocratic structures rather than weaken them. It would tilt the triangle that I've talked about away from citizens and back towards concentrated power. And for a society that has mobilized horizontally sacrificially and morally, I think that would be the most heartbreaking outcome of all. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Metre. You've been excessively polite in not mentioning that kleptocracy might also exist among some of the negotiators in this country. I trust that that may come up in our discussion as well. Professor Radchenko, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate it. My dear colleague Eugene, who's by the way political scientist, has already gone deeply into history. So since I'm a historian, I will do the political science bit if Eugene, you're fine with that, and just focus on the present instead of talking about the past. Which, by the way, I fully agree with you. And the way you put it, this interaction between security and identity is actually something that a lot of people are not able to grasp. They focus on one thing to the exclusion of the other, and they're just unable to see that decisions have multiple causes, and history generally likes multi-causality. So very much in tune with you on that. So if then you allow me to talk about where we are today. We're obviously amidst negotiations. A new round is about to start in Geneva. On the Russian side, we will have once again a delegation headed by Vladimir Medinsky, who is, of course, an aide to Putin, but also a fairly notorious figure. In the past, his participation in peace talks with Ukraine was regarded as an indication of the lack of seriousness of the Russian intent, on the premise that if Putin really wanted serious negotiations, he would send somebody more on the side of the military and the side of the security, not a propaganda former minister of culture who likes to talk about ancient history and so on and so forth. But we'll see. We'll see. I mean, it is the Russians see this new round in Geneva as a place where they'll discuss so-called root causes of the conflict, which of course is something that they have been talking about for a long time. By the way, the Russians have not made any concessions whatsoever in all the negotiations, or whether they're real or fake, we don't know. Most people, I think, would say that they're probably fake negotiations on the Russian side. But in all of these negotiations, the Russians have not yet shown any desire to make any compromise whatsoever. And I think the expectation going into the talks in Geneva is fairly limited. The expectation is damp. We're not really looking for a breakthrough here and now. Nevertheless, let me, in the few minutes that I have, try to highlight for you the issues in these negotiations and the unanswered questions that go back to our understanding of what Putin actually wants. And there is no agreement on this, right? So if I tell you today that Putin wants this, you might counter that and say, no, that's not the case. Putin wants something else entirely. And we can argue all day about what he really wants. The problem is there's not evidence. There's not enough evidence to support any of this hypothesis. So all we can do is we can just sort of imagine what we think we would want in Putin's shoes, and maybe that's a counterproductive way of doing it, or maybe it is a useful way of doing it, but I will present that as a set of alternative desires on Putin's part. So first of all, Putin wants certain territories. He has annexed several regions of eastern Ukraine, which we all know what they are. Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk Oblast, Kherson and Zaporizhia, as well as Crimea, and he does not occupy all of those oblasts. So one of the fairly long-standing demands on his part has been to have Ukraine withdraw from that territory, a demand that has been met with some understanding on the part of American negotiators, but has been rejected vehemently by the Ukrainians on the reasonable ground that though the territory is well defended and that once they withdraw from this territory, there is no guarantee really that Putin will not continue his war and just simply use some other pretext to invade whatever remains of the truncated version of Ukraine. So that is an issue that has been debated endlessly in previous months in the negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Russians and the Americans, and it seems that the Americans are neither here nor there. It seems that sometimes they are putting pressure on the Ukrainians to withdraw from those territories, and at other times they seem to relent a little bit and listen to the Ukrainian view that actually this is a counterproductive idea, and that if you force something like that on the Ukrainians, then this kind of peace is not going to be worth the Nobel Peace Prize, right? It's not going to be something that will win President Trump a lot of accolades. So this is one issue. Now, we don't know, by the way, where things are with this, right? We know that Marco Rubio recently commented that this remains a sticking issue and they have not been able to resolve that. It's a major issue. Other issues, security guarantees. That's something that has puzzled me for a long, long time. Going back actually to those negotiations negotiations in Istanbul between the Russians and the Ukrainians, not in 2025, but in 2022, because at that time, the Ukrainians wanted security guarantees, something similar to NATO Article 5 security guarantees for Ukraine. And at that time, the Biden administration was decidedly uninterested in this. The British also were not particularly interested because nobody really wanted, and I think it's still fair to say that nobody wants even now to fight a war with Russia over Ukraine. I think that's the reality. And when we today have something called the coalition of the willing, to me sometimes it sounds like something of a farce really among European countries, because there's a lot of rhetoric, there's very little action, and there are promises to send troops to Ukraine, some kind of a tripwire force after the war is over, which is, as partial as it gets. To my mind, it's better not to talk, but to carry big stick, and that would be a better approach to Russia. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have been insisting on those security guarantees, which puzzles me. In which sense? It's not clear that they're getting them, and even if they were promised security guarantees, which is very hard to sell, for example, to the American people, if push came to shove, would there be credibility to these security guarantees? It's not so clear. In the end, Ukraine really has to rely more than anything else on its own military, which is, by the way, another sticking point in these negotiations. It was a sticking point in the negotiations in Istanbul in 2022, and when multiple times Putin said that actually those negotiations almost produced an agreement. We've seen the documents, right? We've seen this so-called agreement. We know that almost was not really an almost. Why? Because of that gigantic disagreement over what kind of military Ukraine should be allowed to have, what kind of weapons, what range of weapons. Go back to documents of 2022, you'll see vast disagreements between the Russians and the Ukrainians about the types of weapons Ukraine should be allowed to have. And by the way, things like drones are not even mentioned in that documents. That's just how the war has changed over the last 4 years. You go back there, people on both sides were thinking in completely different terms about how wars were to be fought. And now we have a very different scenario. And I imagine that there's not going to be a lot of progress because the Ukrainians will insist that they should not have any restrictions on their military, and the Russians will insist on restrictions on the range of weapons and so on and so forth. How will this issue be resolved? Will this issue be debated in Geneva? Has there been any progress? This has been actually one issue that has not featured in headlines at all. We don't know how it's being debated. We don't know how close the sides are to agreement on this. I suspect not very close at all. So those are some of the sort of big issues. On the Russian side, further, we have the demand that Ukraine is neutral. I think that is actually an easy one. That is because I never could understand. I think that's actually a major failure of American foreign policy going back to the revered Bush George W. Bush administration and their decision in 2008 in Bucharest to promise a NATO future for Ukraine without actually meaning that. I think that was a foreign policy mistake, frankly, because it left Ukraine in this bizarre situation in the lurch. With the desire to join NATO, but without real prospect of joining NATO. And I also could not understand when in the last NATO summit of the Biden administration in Washington, there was in the statement the promise that Ukraine will join, or Ukraine's future is in NATO. That was the actual wording of the document. If you don't, I mean, there are no realistic ways of getting Ukraine to join NATO, and you don't actually plan on making this happen, why do you put this in the document? Why do you feed the false hopes that Ukraine will join NATO? So in many ways, I think that we've actually kind of worked through this in the last few months, and it seems that it's quite possible to resolve this particular question, that some kind of undertaking would be made not to allow Ukraine join NATO. Is that possible as a part of a solution? I think probably it's actually possible. It's not as difficult to resolve some of the other issues that we have been talking about. And then we have a set of demands on the Russian side that have long been dismissed by the West as some kind of Russian propaganda, that that they should not be taken seriously, and those are just negotiating ploys rather. And that includes the use of the Russian language, which the Russians now want to make official for Ukraine. That also concerns a number of Ukrainian laws, which the Russians want to change, which concern things that Eugene talked about: historical memory, decommunization, and also now the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, how serious are the Russians? I suspect that in Geneva, they'll raise all of those issues and they'll say, we want real concessions on those issues. Why do the Ukrainians resist this? This is because this would basically, well, for two reasons. First, it would allow the Russians to extend their influence. Consider, for example, how the Russian Orthodox Church is used for channeling Russian political influence, because of course it is directly connected to the Kremlin. But it is also a question of national sovereignty. If Ukraine is forced to change its national laws because of what the Russians say, what kind of sovereignty does it really have? And of course, the point of the Kremlin, as Eugene has already mentioned, is to precisely strip Ukraine of its sovereignty. In other words, to have a situation where the Kremlin decides what laws Ukraine may or may not be allowed to have. So those are the points that are going to be discussed in negotiations. A couple of more things which I think are interesting, and let's kind of watch that space, because to me it's tantalizing. First is what is the Russian position on Ukraine joining the EU? We know that Ukraine really wants to join the European Union. The Russians have not been consistent on this issue. Sometimes they have said that they actually don't have any problem with Ukraine joining the EU. At other times, however, you go back and Lauren has discussed 2014 extensively. Well, those events were basically precipitated by Yanukovych refusing to sign the association agreement with the European Union, and basically he was under pressure from the Russians. So in the end, is the EU a problem for the Russians, or are they going to say, yeah, fine, join the European Union? Or do they actually think that that it's not a realistic prospect, so they can support Ukraine in joining the European Union, knowing full well that Hungary or anybody else might actually veto that, and that's not going to actually happen? So that's one thing, a space that should be watched. The other one is Putin's sheer preoccupation with getting rid of Zelensky. President Zelensky obviously has faced some hard times recently due to corruption scandals, and Putin is very keen to get rid of him, because that is a way for him to sort of punish Ukraine, and also send a signal to all the others in the former Soviet periphery, in the Russian periphery today: do not do what Zelensky did. Do not raise your voice against Russia, or the same thing will befall you. The same thing will happen to you. So that's about it's about humiliating Ukraine, humiliating Zelensky, about sending a signal to others among those that Russia still considers to be within its so-called sphere of influence. So you can see that Putin's agenda is pretty multi-layered, and I alluded in the beginning to this question of what do we know what actually Putin wants. The American negotiators appear to believe that Putin has limited aims, limited goals with regard to Ukraine, partly because he's pressed by economic problems. And those economic problems are really serious, partly because he fears escalation of sanctions, in particular American sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector. But he will allegedly, according to that interpretation of events, will basically limit himself to controlling whatever, let's say the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass, a chunk of Ukraine, and then he will just let the rest of Ukraine exist happily as an independent, albeit truncated, but sovereign independent state. So that's one interpretation of Putin's goals. Another, if you go to Ukraine and you talk to anybody in Kyiv, you talk to political analysts in Kyiv, they'll say, you don't understand. This guy, and you've just heard, obviously, Eugene lay out this long array of what the Russians want in Ukraine. People will say, no, that's not what he wants. He has not started this crazy war and killed 1 million people just for the sake of controlling some strip of territory in Donbass that is completely useless for any purpose. He is trying to do that because he wants to control Ukraine politically, and he will not stop in Donbass. He wants to exert that political control, not necessarily by annexing Ukraine, but basically by turning Ukraine into Belarus, something like that, and turning Ukrainian president into a Lukashenko 2.0. Practically, or Yanukovych 2.0. So that is the problem. We don't know what Putin actually wants. I tend to think that he's more maximalist on this. But if you push me for evidence, I'll say, well, of course, we don't really know. We don't have the evidence. And so I think I'll leave you with this. That's where we are. We'll see how those negotiations turn out. I'm not very hopeful.
Thank you very much, Professor Radchenko. I might risk a comment here. My familiarity with Ukraine is not as deep as the three speakers you've already heard, but I did spend a few weeks in Kyiv last May, lecturing at the Kyiv School of Economics and talking with a lot of Ukrainians. My impression, frankly, is that the Ukrainians are correct in believing that Putin's requirements are maximalist. I think this is a contest over statehood, not over territory, but over the existence of an independent Ukraine. And I think that partly because I agree with Professor Finkel's analysis that the security threat from Ukraine is not that Ukraine would invade Russia. It's a ridiculous idea, I think, but that Ukraine as an independent democratic society that would join the European Union and maybe even NATO would present a very serious alternative that some people in Russia, especially in some of the federated republics, would want to follow. So I've revealed my own preference for an answer to Professor Radchenko's range of that he posed about Putin's objectives. But let me focus a little bit more attention, not just on Putin, but on Russians more generally. And I wonder if Professor Radchenko, you can tell us something maybe about the military and civilian surroundings for Putin. Is there any sign there of growing unhappiness or dissent? And Lauren, I'm wondering whether you, as a Russian studies student at SAIS, could enlighten us a bit more broadly on the range of views in Russian society. And Eugene, whatever you feel like commenting on, In particular, I guess, on whether these concerns about identity and security that you see as central to this war, whether those concerns really exist broadly in Russian society. Is this only an elite phenomenon? Does it extend to the Far East, for example? Let me start us off in that direction, thinking a little bit more deeply about Russia. Professor Radchenko, do you want to take up my challenge?
Right, Dan. Well, thank you for this question. It's a very difficult one, and I should say that I would not claim any great expertise on Putin's inner circle. I cannot travel to Russia. It's not that I cannot. I guess I could, but it's probably not recommended for health-related reasons. And so with time, you sort of lose contact, you lose a sense of what is going on. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was recently in Doha, and there were some Russians there, and some I knew, some Russians from like think tanks, etc. Some I knew, but there were also these new Russians who I've never heard of, because you have sort of a rotation. Old people disappear, maybe, I mean, not quite in the Stalinist sense. Maybe they retire, or maybe they flee somewhere. I don't know. And you have this new people who come to the institutes who are sometimes very hawkish, actually, very pro-Putinist, young as well. And you think, wow, it's how interesting. I don't even know who these people are. Like 5 years ago, I knew the whole Moscow setup. You'd go there, you'd talk to all these people, you sort of knew what people were talking about, and now you don't even know who these people are. So it's very, very challenging. But I should draw your attention to a new book that was published by somebody called Alexander Prokopenko, who's a fantastic, fantastic economist at the Carnegie setup in Berlin. And he's got a new book in which she analyzes the state of the thinking of the Russian elites. And she has better context than I do. And so on the basis of those conversations that she had, she shows that actually a lot of people, they, obviously disagree in Putin's circle. They disagree with what's going on, but they've sort of come around to accepting that, right? They've come around to accepting that they don't have a choice, given especially that, for example, if you think about the oligarchs, where after the war, after the outbreak of the war, which I think was actually a bad mistake on the part of the Western governments, they were sanctioned because the idea was that they will be so fearful of sanctions they will overthrow Putin. I don't know what the thinking was there, but anyway, they all sort of took their money to Russia and fled to Russia, and now they're sitting there and they don't really have options. And so because of the oligarchs, the economic bloc in the government, they all see that this is not going in the right direction. They all see how horrible that is, but they don't really have any options. They have to work for the regime. And then if you look at the Siloviki, right, the FSB, the military, etc., I mean, these people have always been the vilest imperialists, and they are as hardcore Putinist as Putin himself. Now, that does not preclude black swan events from appearing. Like, think about the Prigozhin mutiny. Who would have predicted that? Nobody predicted that. And so it appeared, and suddenly everybody was saying, oh, look at this, Russia may be falling apart. Except a few days later, we all said, well, maybe not this time. Next time, right? So we don't know what's really happening. We know that people are in Putin's circle have basically come around to accepting the reality that this is for the long term, at least for as long as Putin is alive. Now, Putin has decided through organ rejuvenation and whatever he was telling Xi Jinping the other day to live for 170 years. So I'm not very hopeful.
Thank you. Lauren?
So maybe I'll talk a little bit about, the perspective from Russian society. And in a previous position, we were actually able to do a lot of polling of Russian society, after the full-scale invasion, asking sort of what would be the breaking points, for Russian social support. And at the time, this was before, I think, the total media blitz that Putin has, put on Russia in terms of how the war is described to most everyday Russians. Russians were actually saying, like, we will accept the war, but not to the, the detriment of, of our own economic well-being, that sort of social contract that everyone talked about, that we will expect, we will accept authoritarianism as long as we have sort of economic and social stability and well-being was still in place. But I would argue that I think one of the things that the war has shown is that the growing impoverishment, especially of rural communities as a result of the war, has actually helped in terms of the support for the war, in the sense that young men who have no status in Russia and who have no sense of a future in Russia are willing to go to the front, okay, in order to provide for their families even after their deaths, or to provide some sort of honor, on them that they're not receiving in their everyday lives. So that argument, I think, is out. I think poverty has actually helped there. I think there was also a hope. I did a lot of my research on Russia's regions. And there was some talk about whether, ethnic minorities who are being sent to the front in great numbers would protest them dying and being recruited in large numbers outside of Moscow and Russia. But I'm thinking you're seeing the same sort of poverty argument there, that they are willing to go and fight and earn the significant, compensation that the Russian state is willing to offer them. The third thing that I wanted to say is that, then there is sort of the hope, and I know it's Ukraine's new strategy, that battle deaths, an increase in battle deaths that the Ukrainians are hoping to inflict, moving, I think, from 30,000 deaths per month, absolutely mind-boggling, to 50,000 deaths per month, will force within Russia a sort of a recruitment effort, a large-scale recruitment effort that will create political distrust and imbalance within Russia. But I've just seen recently that Putin is very cleverly getting around this, by mobilizing previous reserves through quiet recruitment in rural areas. So I can't say right now that there's any fracture that I really see in Russian society itself, in terms of support for the war. To be honest, when you have poverty actually driving support, and recruitment efforts that are not yet, sort of raising political risk. So.
Eugene, Sergey and Lauren both don't see movement inside Russia that would lead to an end of this war. Do you see something else, or are you in agreement with them?
No, I'm absolutely in agreement with them. The thing is that we honestly don't know. When I was doing my PhD, we used to make fun of the, older generations of people who studied Russia, the so-called Kremlinologists, who try to figure out what's going on there by looking who is standing there on the Kremlin wall during the parades. Well, I think we're now a bit worse than that, because at least those people knew how to approach the reality and what they're dealing with. We do not know, and we have so much more noise coming out of Russia that it's much harder for us to make sense out of the situation. So the elites, I mean, what do they want? And that goes back to Sergey's point about what Putin wants. I mean, I wouldn't know for sure. That requires going into their brains, and it's a very dark and scary place. I would rather not to. But it's pretty sure that the majority of them are indeed hawkish, and those who are not hawkish are either dead, quiet, or retired. So about this, and the society in general, yeah, there, among the political scientists, there are huge fights over whether we can trust polls coming out of Russia, and there is still public opinion polling being done in Russia. What's his value it's unclear, but yeah, there is a general sense that at least, there is an acceptance and resignation that, nothing is going to change the system. And it's actually also historically pretty standard Russian attitude that, it is what it is. There is nothing we can do about it, even if it means that we all die, because there is nothing we can do about it. But in terms of popular support, so it's not that people like the war. There are certainly very many people who do and benefit from it. In many ways, the majority simply seem, and again, with the caveats that we don't really know the numbers, but the majority simply seem to accept the reality. But also, on the other hand, going back to my points about how Russians view Russia, and Ukraine also have quite a lot of polling from pre-invasion times when you could do public opinion analysis there. And all those things that I was talking about, not believing that Ukraine is a real state, or believing that large chunks of Ukraine belong to Russia and should be Russian, that Ukrainians are essentially Russians who speak a funny dialect. It is a pretty widespread perception. We know that from pre-war years. So, what does it tell us about Russia? Again, the proof is in the pudding. People are still fighting. People are still signing up for many reasons. But, Russia still has not run out of people. And I apologize, at 7 p.m., the lights here in the building go off, so I will turn them on back.
Thank you, Eugene. Let me ask one final question of the panel. I wonder if you could focus a little bit of attention on Washington, D.C. And what's your perception of what the Americans are trying to achieve and why? Question. Eugene, you want to start us off on that?
I'm honestly not sure. I mean, I thought I had a pretty decent understanding of the thinking during the Biden administration. I disagreed with a lot of it. I think it was counterproductive and too cautious and misread quite a lot of Russian intentions, but at least they were more or less consistent in what they want to achieve. With the current administration, I honestly have no clue, and I suspect that people in the administration itself have no clue. I'm also not sure, looking from the outside, who is actually doing what, whether it's Witkoff, whether it's Rubio, whether it's Trump and Kushner and all that. But it's also, on top of that, it's also pretty clear to me that, on top of not having a clear goal, the current administration simply has no understanding of Russia or Ukraine, and the expertise has been hollowed out. And those people simply seem to live in their own perceptions and their own modes of thinking, which, let me put it this way, are not necessarily connected to empirical reality on the ground.
Lauren?
I think I hinted on it a little bit in my opening remarks, Dan, and my issue around sort of the introduction of oligarchic politics, I think was actually directed at the United States. I mean, just for me, I mean, I do think there's a struggle within the administration on, between different factions on what the negotiating strategy with Russia should be. Although I'm not even sure that those strategies remain sort of fixed in time, and seem to be more about positioning within within the different factions, and any sort of real attempt to solve a Ukraine peace process. But I will say, I mean, the one thing that I do actually worry about, because you saw it, I think, with the Ukrainians, very clever, I thought, cut of a mineral deal to keep, Trump in the mix, and keep him in support of Ukraine. You do worry. Woodcock and Kushner are the lead negotiators. They are interested in an economic deal. You've seen it articulated several different times, whether it is the U.S. being offered a portion of the funds that Brussels holds, the frozen Ukrainian assets, the mineral deal, etc. And I worry that Ukraine is willing to accept some sort of business deal in order to, achieve some of the things that it wants to achieve around security guarantees. And I would have to honestly say that I think the kleptocratic aspect of the final negotiation worries me just as much as the security guarantees, given what, Ukrainian civil society has fought so hard to eradicate within their own country.
Thank you. Sergey, any comment on the Americans?
So I think it's pretty clear that President Trump does not really care about Ukraine. He doesn't really care about Russia either. He doesn't really care about Europe, all of those strange places. What he cares about is achieving peace, so that he looks good, and people will say, look at President Trump. Nobody could do that, but he was able to do that. Isn't that a great, amazing achievement? And so that puts him in a position of he wants to be in a hurry. He's in a hurry to do that, not least, I think, because of the midterm elections, to show the American people that, look, nobody else could do that, and I could do that. And that puts him in a bad position in peace negotiations, because what you have is a mismatch in terms of the schedules. You have an American president who's super in a hurry, doesn't really care about small details, just wants to strike a deal very quickly, get it done, show it to the American people, and then forget about it. And you have a Russian president who's playing the long game. And if you have a match between these two people, one is in a hurry, the other is playing the long game. The one who's playing the long game has more strategic patience and is therefore able to turn the situation to his advantage. And so what we see for all those months of talks between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine, President Trump has already made lots of concessions to Russia. For example, by inviting Putin to Alaska, giving him the stage, which of course Putin loved that. He took it to China with him, saying, "Look at that, the Americans respect us now," etc. So you've got that. You've got all these concessions to the Russian president. You have occasional efforts to pressure him, but not sufficient. Not sufficient. What you need to do instead to really help the peace process, and I'm in favor of that. I think the peace process is something we should have, clearly, but it's not for nothing that President Reagan spoke about having a foreign policy from a position of strength. You want to be speaking from a position of strength, because the more pressure you put on Russia, whether in terms of military supplies to Ukraine, whether in terms of economic pressure, whether in terms of stopping gray shadow fleet tankers, which, by the way, the Trump administration, by the way, to their credit, has been doing much more of than even the Europeans, who just talk about it and never do anything. But the more you do that, the better you are in actually forcing Putin to reconsider his schedule and understand that time is not on his side, because now he thinks that time is on his side. And if time is on your side, why would you want to make any concessions? Because you've just wait another day. Things are better. Things are better. So this calculus has to be reconsidered.
Thank you. I hasten to comment from my own point of view, which includes deep experience in the Balkans, that the Americans have a long tradition of twisting the arm of their friends more than twisting the arm of their enemies, because it's easier. And I think you're seeing that happen with Ukraine and Russia. I'm going to take Q&A now from here, and I'm not sure how I do it online, but I see one right away back there. Can you do that?
We will try the microphones. All right, I cannot be seen by the panel, but
Could you
of
introduce
course,
yourself?
yes. My name is Simon Kaspark. I was first year in Bologna last year, and my question is sort of related to what we were just discussing with the American position and the negotiations. So I guess my question is also directed to Professor Radchenko, primarily. So we have a situation now where almost all military aid to the Ukrainians is coming from Europe or financed by Europe. President Macron also went out and said that almost all intelligence now, which was previously given by the Americans primarily, is now also handled by Europe. But then when it comes to the negotiations, okay, I'm having a zoom in here. When it comes to the negotiations, we see that the Europeans are completely sidelined. And instead, it's like a Ukrainian, or is it like the Russians and the Americans are sort of negotiating a little bit, sometimes talking to Ukrainians. When with all these other issues we're seeing in the transatlantic relationship, I'm wondering, is there any way or possibility that at some point sorry.
Okay, we lost the most important part of the question. There
Sorry,
was
yeah,
a possibility at some point.
I'm just wondering, in a sense, like, why are the Americans the ones doing this? Is it because they have the power to deliver security guarantees? Is it just because they're the most powerful nation? What can we imagine anything happening in the future where the Europeans and the Americans split and somehow try and sideline the Americans in these negotiations? Sorry, yeah, for the long question. Thank you.
Mr. Radchenko?
Well, I agree. Very quick response to this question. I think the problem was that at the start, back in February, the Europeans priced themselves out of negotiations when President Trump called Putin. The Europeans should have been right there saying, look, we are at the table. We are going to be there. Instead, they waited for a month and month and month and had their own separate negotiations with Trump in order to pull him away from Putin, as we witnessed, for example, in August during that emergency summit in Washington, when a bunch of European leaders flew to Washington to try to kind of massage Trump to talk him out of whatever he promised Putin, and that looked pathetic. It really looked pathetic for Europe. So they should have been much more active earlier on, understanding that you have to deal with the Russians. I think the idea that you don't talk to the Russians because Putin is a bad guy is preposterous. You have to talk to bad guys, and you have to set down conditions. And Europe holds a lot of cards, not least on the economic front, and could be much more active militarily as well in doing something about the Shadow Fleet, for example, which is something that the Europeans have been very reluctant to do. You talk to the Nordics and the Baltics, and they say, well, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and this and that. And of course, the Russians do whatever they want. So I think that is changing, by the way. I think in recent months and weeks, the Europeans have become more assertive, I think. There's more signaling from at least some of the European member states, not least France, for example. We've had communications between President Macron and Putin. The problem remains that Europe is obviously 27 voices, and some of them say one thing, Orban says one thing, the Germans say another thing, the French say the third thing. And a lot of that, yes, is coordinated through Brussels, and Brussels is yet another voice as well. So it's become very complicated, and the Russians are ignoring Brussels altogether. They say Brussels doesn't actually matter and doesn't exist or something. They want bilateral negotiations. So all of that is very complicated. But I think in the end, the Russians are miscalculating because the Europeans are slow, but they are slowly coming around, and they will emerge, I think, gradually but surely as a major geopolitical actor that will be a much greater problem to the Russians than Putin ever imagined. So for now, yes, they're a little bit not, I guess, as involved as they should be, but we see a lot more willingness to do that now. You still see resolve on the economic front, and you see Europe getting its act together on the military and defense front, and we can discuss what that actually means, but they're getting their act together, and that will be a major card in negotiations with future Russia.
Eugene or Lauren, do you want to add on this point? No. Okay, did you hear that? It's about China and whether China will get more involved.
You were muted. No, we're not. You were muted. Oh. Maybe just repeat the.
The question is about China.
Can you hear me on the panel? Yes, the question's basic.
Whether China will get more involved.
Yeah, do you see a reason for China to change its position or its role as this develops and become more involved?
Okay, I think that's for you, given your Sino expertise.
Am I the China guy? Am I the China guy for the
You're
purposes?
the China guy right now.
All right. I mean, the Chinese, look, the Chinese have been saying the same thing for 4 years. Yeah, we want this war to end, we're for dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. If you watched Wang Yi's speech in Munich a couple of days ago, the Munich Security Conference, again, he talked about that. Like, yeah, we're in favor of dialogue. And when pushed, what will China do? He is just not willing to say what China will do. But we know what China is actually doing, right? We know that China is providing a market for Russian oil and gas. Did you know that Russia is China's #1 supplier of crude at the moment? That's a major source of earnings for the Russian budget, major source of earnings. The other is India, by the way. India is also taking a lot of Russian crude, although we know now that the Indians are scratching their heads a little bit with regard to this because of the pressure from the Trump administration. We're still to see how this will play out and whether Russia will actually be in a situation where they'll have trouble selling their oil to India. But China continues to take Russian crude. China continues to take large volumes of Russian gas, though not as much as the Russians would like to sell them, because the Russians want to build another pipeline to China, and the Chinese are bargaining over the price and various other provisions of the contract. So that is not happening. But still, China is a major enabler because it is buying Russian oil and gas. And also it is providing dual-use technologies to the Russians, and has been doing that on a major scale. Look at the drone components, for example, drones that Russia uses against Ukraine. This stuff comes from China. And the Chinese say, oh, but by the way, we also provide drone components to the Ukrainians. And that is, by the way, that's true, but on a much smaller scale. So if you look at who is actually benefiting from China's position, clearly it is Russia. Why? Because China thinks geopolitically, and they understand that Russia is an important strategic partner. What does that mean? It doesn't mean they love the Russians. I mean, nobody's saying that the Chinese love the Russians, right? We won't even go there. But they understand that Russia is a kind of what do you call that? The thing for thunder. I forget the word in English now. The one that attracts lightning. Lightning rod. That's what I'm talking about. It's the lightning rod for Western rage. They're going after Russia, and while that is happening, China is fine. And what if you put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes? Would you want Russia's defeat? No, you don't want to do that, because then China will become weaker, objectively weaker. So they don't want Russia's defeat. Maybe they're not exactly sure about Russia's victory either. And we know that they don't like the idea of a nuclear war. Nobody likes the idea of nuclear war. The Chinese have repeatedly expressed their opposition to this prospect. But beyond that, it doesn't seem that they are particularly keen on actually ending the war, not least, by the way, because it's tying Russia to China in ways that would have been unthinkable a few years ago.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Oleg Shakirov. I'm a PhD student here. To build on the previous question, when the war started in 2022, there was a lot of effort
Alec, you've disappeared.
No,
can't-
can you hear me?
Now you've reappeared. You have to press the button or something.
Okay.
Oh,
So
now
the
we
question is the fight for the global public opinion. I know it's like a nebulous subject, but in 2022, everyone was fighting for the global public opinion. And what's your take on what's happening now with this public opinion of the rest of the world, those countries who are not directly involved in the conflict? From my perspective, it seems like everyone is kind of fed up with this like European war and is not willing to get involved. And in the West, there is no much interest to beyond Trump's efforts to limit oil purchases by India. There is not much interest in what the rest of the world thinks, but maybe you disagree.
Eugene, would you take this on?
Sure, I can try. And by the way, so I saw the camera moving and I saw a couple of Bologna students in the audience. Hi, guys. Hope you're enjoying DC. So I think it's right. Yeah, there was a fight on the about the global opinion. I can probably talk more about the Ukrainian/Western side of it. There was a genuine effort to reach out to audiences in Africa, in Latin America, or in the global South. Whatever this means, it has mostly failed, and the Ukrainians, and I think also fair to say about the allies in the EU and the US have abandoned that. There are many reasons why it failed. Some of that is simply the attention switched. October 7th happened, and then that shifted the discussion. Part of it is just historical orientations of quite a few of those people and their sympathies towards Russia. And Putin, quite of that is economic connections with Russia. Quite a lot of that. Quite a lot of that is cynicism and self-interest on the part of the global South. So there are many reasons for why that happened. But yeah, I think it's right. I think from the Ukrainian and the Western perspective, essentially only two players remain, and that's the US and EU or EU plus NATO, more generally, that they care about. From a global conflict, it became more or less in the regional European one with US attached.
Lauren, I saw you nodding agreement, but I wonder if you have something to add.
No, I'd just like to say when I was at the National Democratic Institute, I actually worked on China and Russia in the world, in Africa and Latin America. And I would say a couple of things. Russia in Africa launched a very concerted disinformation campaign about the Ukrainian war, playing on Russia's longstanding sort of position in Africa as sort of a supporter of African liberation movements. Many of whose long enduring leaders, came from those roots. So it really sort of the Russian narratives played into political elites and their longevity in Africa and many, many countries. And so I think this was very successful. I think, in addition, China has managed to suppress in terms of disinformation. China controls many of the media outlets in Africa. There is very little independent reporting on the war in Ukraine. So I think that these disinformation efforts, frankly, have been highly successful. At the time that they were being mounted, there was a big push, I think, on the US and Western side around whether there could be anything done to counter these narratives, including introducing, Ukraine in those particular circles to promote its own narratives, et cetera. But those simply died with the Trump regime. So there are really no voices in Africa, alternative voices, to be speaking to the other side of the Ukraine conflict. They pretty much have dominated the space.
I wonder if I can ask a question. My impression is that the grain issue has evaporated. And I've always assumed that that meant that grain was getting out of Ukraine and Russian-controlled Ukraine and getting out of the Black Sea. And that had been one of the major concerns in the South. Have I got that right? Has that issue simply been obvied?
So I will try my jump in because, before this Ukraine book, I actually have written a book about the role of grain and food in Russian politics and security thinking, and have followed and have written about, what's going on the ground in Ukraine. So there was a lot of fear about what the war might do for global food security. It less concerned the West because it's something that most people do not understand is Russia right now is by far the largest, the most important grain exporter in the world. They control about between 25 to 30% of the global grain market. And what the war did was to essentially destroy the export capacity to a large degree of Ukraine and another major grain producing country. And Russians are also literally stealing quite a lot of grain from Ukraine. There was a perception that all those areas near the front line in southern and eastern Ukraine is some kind of wasteland that nobody gets there because it's heavily mined. War is going on. In fact, we know from satellite observations that it's not true. Those areas are being heavily cultivated. It's black grain that does not appear in any statistics, certainly not in the Ukrainian statistics because it's not under Ukrainian control. It's not, but it's also does not appear in the Russian statistics. It's enough grain to feed 90 million people. It goes out of Ukraine and it goes out strategically, exactly to places that Russia wants to keep quiet, like Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, places that historically depend on Russian grain. And Russians also pretty, quite explicit about what they can do about the issue. And if you look at their leaders, they talk about, grain being a much more powerful weapon than missiles. They literally threaten to starve those countries in the third world that depend on the Russian grain if they disagree with them. So there is a very strategic use of Russian grain. Overall, the war has not had a major impact of the global market of the global food security, but one of the countries is using this grain very smartly to its advantage, and that's Russia.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, thank you so much. This is Gülgür from American University, and I'm here with my students. We came here as a whole class to learn about, being updated about the conflict. I'm a professor of conflict resolution too. So my question is, the picture that you draw is a stalemate. Maybe you can just tell if you think differently. But in this political and military stalemate, given that I'm just referring to political imagination right now, like what is possible politically? And if you think that there is a need for a change or this conflict disruption, what can this be to get the parties out of this deadlock? What is possible? Thank you.
Thank you. Eugene, you're on my screen. You want to try?
Sure, I can start. So I think the perception of the stalemate is more or less correct. I don't think it's a stable stalemate though. So to quote my predecessor as the professor of conflict management at SAIS, the great late Bill Zartman, to move from here, you need a mutual supporting stalemate. And I don't think we are there. We are there yet. I mean, there is enough hurt going on, but at least from the Russian perspective, I don't think as of now the hurt has been felt enough in economic and political terms domestically or militarily in Ukrainian terms. Yes, they're losing territory, but on a small rate, and they're inflicting huge losses on the Russians. But this dynamic is not enough to make the stalemate really mutually hurting and move it politically. But I also don't think that the stalemate is sustainable in the long run. So I like to think about the situation as two sand clocks, 2-hour pieces with the sand running out, and those are two different types of sands. For Ukraine, it's clearly a military sand. For Russia, it's a socioeconomic sand. So the question is, which sand will run out, whether Ukraine will run out of people or ammunition to allow some major Russian breakthrough, and then we will see some change, or whether the Russian economic and social problems, which are accumulating, really start hurting not just the lower middle classes and not just the outlying provinces, but places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and then we'll push for some change. I don't know which one. The problem is that it's impossible to predict, when those hourglasses will run out of sand and what will happen then. So for now, yes, stalemate, but it's not a sustainable one, at least in my view. I actually would be very interested to hear.
I like that image of the two sand clocks. Lauren, you want to comment on this?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that Russia is trying right now. As I've mentioned before, I think this total mobilization in Ukraine, this total citizen mobilization, is just as important to Ukraine's defense. We hear a lot about the army and the holding the line, but it is a complete 100% mobilization of Ukrainian citizens that frankly have really been why Ukraine has been able to sustain this operation for 4 years. And you see Russia attacking, I believe, moving on civilians hard with this striking of energy plants in the dead of winter, trying to, in a way, destabilize Ukrainian civilian support. I see it holding strong. So I don't see this idea of the total defense of Ukraine in any way fracturing. I do agree with Sergey that I think the Europeans are a key player in this. And that as you begin to see, there's a couple things that I think could begin, as Sergey said, to convince Russia that time is not on their side, and that Europe is beginning to stiffen its resolve for the long term. So I think the Europeans have a lot to play there in terms of just a few weeks ago, they passed some major sanctions that kind of surprised everyone. So moving hard on sanctions. I think the other way that the Europeans, I think, could show some resolve is this hybrid warfare on Europe, the drone strikes, the recruitment of young men in the UK and Poland to commit sabotage operations in Europe. I think they're beginning to realize that Europe comprehensively is under threat from Russia in much the same way that Ukraine was under threat before 2014, sort of the softening of Europe for a Russian military or large-scale cyber operation, sort of the instilling of societal fissures in Europe on how to respond, feeling that a fear and under attack and that Europe doesn't have much resilience. I would like to see Europe really move on these hybrid war tactics, and really push back, whether it's through sanctions or some sort of red lines, etc. But as long as Europe is sort of absorbing the idea that even European territory is open to Russia without much impunity. Again, I don't think we'll see much movement in the war.
Sergey?
Right. So, I mean, I think everything has been said, really. I would just raise a couple of hypothetical questions here. One is that sometimes we tend to assume the existence of a direct correlation between Russia's economic problems and Russia's willingness to negotiate in this war. And I think that is probably misplaced. Why is this misplaced? Because Putin sees this war, as I think Eugene has already made clear, as a question of legacy, as a question of how he will be seen by the future historians, how he will be regarded by history as the Tsar, the gatherer of the lands. It doesn't mean that he doesn't care about the economic situation. Of course, he cares about the economic situation. I mean, one example of him also being quite cautious is that he has not, unlike what Lauren has just described with regard to Ukraine, he has not declared mobilization for Russia, right? Russia has much greater resources in terms of human resources and capabilities than Ukraine does, but Putin has not done that. Why is that? Because he maybe feels that this would create social instability. Is that the reason? But you might also ask to what extent Putin would also persevere in his designs on Ukraine, even if the economic situation worsened considerably. For example, go back to the last world economic crisis, when Russian GDP declined by how many? Was it like 7% or something like that in 1 year, right? And Putin survived that just fine. In the 1990s, Russia, without going to any wars, except for the brutal war in Chechnya, lost something like 40% of its GDP. And yet Yeltsin was reelected in 1996. Dubiously, you might say, but he was reelected. So we make those, connections, and we tend to assume that, we'll just put a little more pressure on Russia, and things will start falling apart, and people will take pitchforks and go to the Kremlin. And that is a dangerous proposition. It might happen, but it might not actually happen. And so that would be, I guess, my main observation.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the panel now for some final remarks of any type you like. Eugene, would you like to start off?
No, I honestly don't know what to say, on top of what already has been said. We seem to agree on, most things, and that things are bleak and are not getting any better, at least not in the short run. But no, my final point is that we probably should be optimistic in the long run, because if not, then it will be really bad for all of us.
Thank you. Lauren?
I think the only thing that I would like to say, in terms of the Ukraine peace process, is sort of a broadening of the calculations around the strategic process. Around the peace process and the impact on it, to include the impact on Ukrainian society. And I say that just, one brief point here. We have a population that has fully mobilized horizontally and morally to respond to the war. And we know what happens to societies and peace processes where there has been full mobilization of civil society, and then those expectations in peace processes are not met. The revanchism, the backlash, the really serious risk to Ukrainian democracy, where we might see more hardline political movements of veterans and civil society refusing to psychologically stand down. We might see in many ways, a militarization of civil society, etc. So I just don't think, other than Ukraine's population doesn't seem to be a calculus in these peace discussions. And it's always a puzzle, other than just to say there'll be a referendum, right? There'll be a referendum if, on the territorial situation of the Donbass. So I would just like to see more consideration done to the aftermath and what an unjust peace might look like for Ukraine and what that might do to risk democracy in Europe and in Ukraine.
Sergey?
So little to add, except to say that I'm actually writing a book on the history of the Russia-Ukraine war. And the book is scheduled for approximate publication in 2032, which is which carries with it an implicit assumption that the war might actually last for quite a bit longer. And I want this book to document the war from start to finish, because quite a few books, including Eugene's excellent book, appeared sort of in the middle of the war. And I have also written about the war in the middle of the war. And sometimes it's very difficult to really grasp what's happening when everything is changing on a daily basis, especially, and I really feel for excellent journalists who have written wonderful studies, like Yaroslav Trofimov, for example, has a fantastic book about Ukraine. Simon Schuster has a wonderful kind of a biography of Zelensky. Many others have written about the conflict, but it's like shooting at the moving target. Maybe that's not a great metaphor in this situation. The thing is, a lot will depend on how this war will unfold. And Eugene is quite right to point out that the stalemate can actually be broken at any time. We just don't know how. And I think maybe our assessment of this war will also change depending on how it ends. And that's a weird way of putting it, but we'll have to look back on this time and say, well, once it's over, we'll see what mistakes were made and why. I wrote a book review today, not about anything related to Ukraine, but there's a book written by Scott Anderson, King of Kings. I don't know if you've seen that, probably in Kramer Bookshop or somewhere. It's a very interesting book where he really trashes the US policy, the Carter administration policy towards Iran, and says that it was basically a mixture of hubris, delusion, and catastrophic miscalculation. And of course, writing about it 50 years later, you can say that. Now it is very difficult to say in real time who's making mistakes, why are they making those mistakes. We'll find out in retrospect. So I am trying to write this book. I haven't actually started. What I'm doing now is I'm starting to collect the evidence, but I don't really want to start writing until the war is finished, because then I will be able to look back as a historian, not as a participant, but as a historian, and say, oh, by the way, we really messed up here, there, and elsewhere. Or we made a series of good decisions that led to a wonderful result. Or if we have a nuclear war as a result of all of this, I will not finish this book or even begin it. So in other words, let's, I'm not saying that this is a likely outcome, but I'm just saying that it's important for people like me, historians, I think, to have the space to talk about this 30 years from now, 50 years from now. So come back 30 years from now, I'll tell you what actually happened.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the entire panel. I'm entirely sympathetic with your description of this process as hitting a moving target. I have a commitment to deliver a manuscript by the end of this year that treats Balkans, Middle East, and Ukraine. And I'm feeling very much like I'm aiming at a moving target. And I'm absolutely sure that it will not have the depth of what you're going to write with some historical perspective once the war is over. But I committed to it, and I'll do it. It's a revision of a book I published in 2019. I want to thank the audience, thank the panel. I think we've had a good discussion. It has not cheered me up. And we could all use, I realize, a bit of cheering up. But I will take Eugene's advice to heart that I should be optimistic. I find it difficult to do, but of course, wars do end, and they often end quite unexpectedly. So let's hope for that, and let's hope it is in the right direction. Thank you all. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Dan. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.